DuPont is among the oldest, largest, and depending on who you are, potentially the most infamous companies in US history. This is a controversial subject because some people will say that it has been an outstanding company responsible for multiple creations that have altered the way we live and helped to shape the country and the culture that we have today. But on the opposite end, others will say that DuPont is an evil corporation responsible for countless deaths and has threatened our planet as we know it. Personally, I think that most people looking at this objectively could at least understand where both of these very extreme opinions come from. DuPont has been surrounded by controversy for over 200 years now, so I think it would be interesting to outline what I believe to be 5 of their biggest sources of controversy while doing my best to present them in a fair and balanced manner. DuPont was the last name of a person who immigrated from France to the United States during the French Revolution. He started a company in Delaware that was primarily focused on the production and sale of gunpowder. Later in the century, they started making dynamite and nitroglycerin, so the first area of controversy has to do with firearms and explosives, because for well over 100 years, that was the company's main focus. Something that stands out to me as a potential reason to dislike them going way back is in 1854, even before the American Civil War, there was a massive incident involving DuPont. 3 of their wagons that were transporting 5 tons of gunpowder through Delaware exploded, killing 7 people, 15 horses, and causing $80,000 worth of damages. By the early 1900s, DuPont was responsible for most of the gunpowder and explosives being produced in the United States, making them by far the biggest company to do it. And you can see where people would have issue with this, producing things that are made to hurt people and profiting most during the times of war, going all the way back to the War of 1812. I also want to point out that in 1980, DuPont acquired Remington Arms Company, one of the country's oldest makers of firearms, and remained the owner until selling it 13 years later. This right here is easily among the most controversial industries, and DuPont has one of the longest and most impactful histories within that industry. Another giant source of controversy regarding DuPont has been the size of the company. Throughout its history, many people have criticized it for being too big, too impactful, and having too much control. In 1907, the Department of Justice filed a criminal lawsuit against the company, claiming that it had a monopoly over the explosives industry that was in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been approved 17 years earlier and had already been used to break up monopolies in various other industries. After almost 5 years, DuPont was found to be in violation of the act and ordered to break apart, so they formed 2 new companies that was staffed with former DuPont executives, and effectively closely tied to the original company. Meanwhile, their gunpowder operations remained untouched and would grow bigger than ever during the upcoming World War I. In fact, during that war, DuPont sold over $1 billion worth of powder and explosives and became 50 times more valuable on the stock market. From there, however, DuPont shifted their focus to become heavily involved in various polymers that they created and uniquely branded. Just a few of the many examples would be nylon in the 1930s, lycra in the 1950s, and Kevlar in the 1960s. They are responsible for all of those. Mostly through the creation of these polymers, DuPont developed the reputation of being a chemical company. To this day, that is probably how most people identify them, but they have been involved in so many other areas. These areas include energy, electronics, pharmaceuticals, agriculture. It would be impractical and maybe even tedious to cover all of it in this video. I just want to convey that DuPont was listed as number 10 on the first ever Fortune 500 list in 1955 and has remained a large and diverse company. Just a few random highlights to help you understand their size would be in 1917, they bought a significant portion of General Motors, who went on to become the biggest automaker in the US. By the 1950s, when DuPont owned almost a quarter of it, there were more antitrust concerns because they supplied materials like paint that were used to make the cars, so after a lengthy lawsuit, the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that they had to divest their ownership in it. In 1980, they bought Conoco Oil for $7.8 billion in what was reported to be the largest corporate merger in US history at the time, but they spun it off almost 20 years later. In 2001, they sold their pharmaceuticals division for $7.8 billion. In 2004, 2004, they sold their fiber division for $4.4 billion, and in 2017, they merged with Dow Chemical before splitting apart into 3 separate companies. Today, they remain a multi-billion-dollar company and are one of the few that have been able to say that for as long as they have. The next controversy on my list is PFAS, referring to a group of man-made chemicals that were widely used in consumer products starting in the 1940s. In fact, a study in 2015 conducted by a group of organizations, including the CDC, found PFAS in the blood of 97% of Americans. The issue here is that they have been labeled forever chemicals because they take a really long time to break down, and exposure to certain levels of PFAS may lead to all sorts of health issues, including reproductive and developmental effects, immune system issues, and increased risk of certain cancers. For DuPont, one of their main products to have contained these chemicals is Teflon, used in a variety of ways, but most famously used as a non-stick coating on cookware. There is evidence to suggest that DuPont was well aware of these potential health issues going as far back as the 1960s. One thing that stands out is a study they conducted in 1961 that showed Teflon exposure led to liver enlargement in rats, with one of the scientists making a note that it should be handled with extreme care. It really depends on how you interpret all this information, but many people see it as DuPont knowingly exposing consumers to harmful chemicals for decades. And to add another potentially disturbing layer to this, DuPont's chemical plant near Parkersburg, West Virginia was allegedly responsible for contaminating the water that was used by 70,000 people. It led to a fine by the EPA as well as multiple settlements from residents that were affected by it. I do not want to spend too much time on this simply because it has been pretty widely covered already. For anyone who wants to hear more about it, I highly recommend the New York Times article titled "The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare," or the movie based on that article, Dark Waters, starring Mark Ruffalo as that lawyer. It is probably not the most balanced depiction of the situation, but still very informative and compelling. The next controversy involves the production of chlorofluorocarbons, simply known as CFCs, which are pretty conclusively believed to be harmful to the environment. See, going back before the 1930s, refrigerators were much more dangerous because they used toxic or flammable gases to keep things cold. But then, DuPont came together with Frigidaire and General Motors to search for a safer replacement that resulted in a compound branded by DuPont as Freon that contained CFCs. But for a long time, it was highly praised, considered to be a miracle compound because it made refrigerators a safe and common addition to people's homes, essentially changing the way that people lived. However, by the 1970s, there was scientific research to suggest that CFCs were potentially hurting the ozone layer, which is important because it absorbs up to 99% of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Basically, without the ozone layer, the sun would be much more harmful for our skin, and there would be all sorts of issues. As time progressed, it was looking more and more likely that CFCs were in fact a major contributor to the thinning of the ozone layer, and even helped create a hole in it above the South Pole that was later discovered. In 1978, the United States banned the use of CFCs in aerosol cans, but they remained for use in refrigeration and other things. When all this was happening, DuPont was the world's leading producer of CFCs, responsible for something like a quarter of all CFC production. Considering that totaled to about $600 million in sales each year, well, you can see how they were motivated to maybe overlook the science and continue making it. To be fair, this was a debated issue, and they would repeatedly tell the public that they were well aware of the potential issues and would stop making it if there was a definite concern for the public's health. But as you could imagine, many people, including some government officials, were not happy with their lack of response to some very important concerns. As late as 1988, the chairman of the company said, "At the moment, scientific evidence does not point to the need for dramatic CFC emission reductions." However, only a few weeks later, after a NASA-sponsored panel of over 100 scientists released a comprehensive analysis of the issue, DuPont pledged that they would phase out the production of CFCs over the next decade. Today, they have been mostly replaced by hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are much safer for the environment. The final source of controversy on my list would be DuPont's involvement with GMOs, and at this point, doesn't it really feel like they're almost seeking out controversy because they've been involved in so many different areas that have been protested? GMO refers refers to genetically modified organisms. It is when you alter a crop on a genetic level to change its size or appearance or resistance to pests or whatever else. GMOs have been labeled safe for consumption by practically all the main organizations, but are still commonly criticized for multiple reasons involving the impact on farmers, the environment, the labeling. Again, I'm not trying to weigh in one way or the other. I simply want to convey that many people are in fact against GMOs. Probably the all-time most protested company when it comes to the subject was Monsanto. Well, in the 1990s, it was reported that DuPont was in early talks of merging with Monsanto, but ultimately ended up merging with their main rival, Pioneer Hybrid, which was the biggest seed company in the world. At the time, the chairman of DuPont said, "The deal will make the combined company a leader in gene crop technology and foster products that aren't even on the drawing boards today." Clearly, DuPont became heavily involved in genetically modifying crops, so from that point, anyone against GMOs was probably not a huge fan of DuPont. However, about 20 years later, their agriculture segment was spun off into its own company as part of that big separation into 3 separate companies. Let me know in the comments, what are your thoughts about DuPont? Do they deserve so much hatred and backlash, or have most of their decisions over the years been justified and ethical? There is a lot of touchy subject matter here, so just a few disclaimers before I finish. I hope you already realize that I am not a scientist or any kind of expert on these subjects, nor was I trying to convince you of anything here. My goal was to simply bring awareness to some of DuPont's biggest controversies from more of a business perspective. I also want to be clear that these are not all of their controversies, but rather the bigger, more impactful ones that stood out to me. I recommend that you spend way more time researching each of these subjects before fully forming your own opinions, because I'm not so sure that there are any black and white answers for any of this. Finally, I'm curious, what do you most associate with this company? They have been involved in so many different things over the years that I imagine your age and your interests would have a huge influence on how you perceive them. If I am being honest, whenever I hear the name DuPont, the first thing that comes into my mind is that image of the iconic number 24 Jeff Gordon NASCAR with the giant DuPont logo across the hood. Tell me if that is the same for you. And any other thoughts you have about DuPont or any of their products, please be civil as you leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.